To understand the history of wrestling games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, we have to go all the way back to 1983. That's when the game The Big Pro Wrestling was first developed in Japan, which was initially a stand-up arcade game and was released as Tag Team Wrestling in the United States in 1984. A version was then developed for the Nintendo Entertainment System that was released in 1986, and while the game is considered prehistoric by today's standards, it did feature a vast array of moves. Tag Team Wrestling can lay the all-important claim to be the first wrestling game ever captured on the Nintendo Entertainment System. In October 1986, publisher Bandai released Tag Team Match Muscle. Muscle is spelled out like initials, but I can't find anywhere that explains what the acronym for it actually is. I think they just did it just for looks. The game was very primitive and featured an interesting cast of characters, created guys such as Muscle Man, Terry Man, Ramen Man, Robin Mask, Buffalo Man, Wars Man, Ashura Man, and Geronimo. And there's apparently a gold cartridge edition of the Japanese version out there that's estimated worth is about $2 million. And while two different third-party developers beat them to the literal punch, Nintendo themselves were developing their own professional wrestling game. This would be the game Pro Wrestling that was released in September of 1987. This game was worth the wait for players though, and quickly put its predecessors to shame. The game featured 6 playable characters, everyone from Fighter Hayabusa, Giant Panther, King Corn Karn, King Slender, Starman, and the Amazon. The man that developed this game would later be responsible for developing the Fire Pro Wrestling series, which is beloved to many wrestling gamers out there. The game actually felt and played like real wrestling and received accolades at the time for being a great game, and is also looked back at fondly by retro wrestling gamers. It took the WWE until 1989 to finally release their NES video game product, and that was Acclaim's WWF WrestleMania. The game featured an impressive roster of Bam Bam Bigelow, Ted DiBiase, Randy Savage, Andre the Giant, and of course Hulk Hogan. The graphics were the best of any wrestling game that had been put out to the time, but honestly left the gameplay just somewhat lacking. Essentially, it played a lot worse than pro wrestling. From a gameplay perspective, it was much more of a button masher, and also kind of had an arcade, kind of cartoony type feel to it as well, which definitely suited the WWF product at the time. In 1990, WCW released World Championship Wrestling for the NES console. This game was basically the polar opposite of the WWF's game, in which the gameplay itself was definitely a whole lot better, but the graphics left a lot to be desired. Come to find out that the game was actually a repurposed Japanese version of a game called Superstar Pro Wrestling, which was actually a pretty common practice for video games at the time when they would come from Japan over to the US. Also interesting to note that after you finish off everyone in the game mode, the final boss you have to face is the WCW Master, which is essentially Andre the Giant in a mask, which was, you guessed it, something that they just totally left in from the Japanese version of the game. Despite all these flaws, this game is remembered very fondly by retro gamers. Also, the year of 1990 saw the release of Tecmo World Wrestling. Obviously, this was developed and published by Tecmo, and while there's no official correlation, when you look through the gameplay and the menu footage of the game, I can see some very clear correlations between this and the NES Pro Wrestling game that was released back in 1987. This game, however, was a very much more souped up version of that. Arguably the most comprehensive comprehensive wrestling game that was ever released on the NES console. Each wrestler had a move set of over 20 moves and also featured a roster of 10 wrestlers. The game continued the time-honored tradition of making up characters very similar to real-life wrestlers to avoid copyright infringements. El Tigre, I'm looking at you, pal. This is lamented as probably the best NES wrestling game, and it's hard to argue that. From there, WWF followed up their video game making by releasing WWF WrestleMania Challenge in 1990. This game is thought of as the best WWE game that was released on the NES console, and it definitely featured an upgraded roster from the previous WrestleMania game. It looked a lot better. The controls were definitely better. At the end of the day, though, it's still very hard to consider this a good game of any sort of quality. So being that as it may, WWF went back to the drawing board in 1992 and released WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge. I consider this to be essentially the same game that they had just released, albeit with an updated roster, and also featured, you guessed it, the first ever steel cage match featured in a wrestling game. That in of itself, I believe, was the selling point. The wrestling video game industry is still doing the same things to this day, as we see 2K put out essentially the same wrestling game every year, just with updated features and a few updated graphics. So it's safe to say at this point the WWE pretty much had the wrestling video game market cornered, as in 1993, their fourth wrestling game within a 6-year time period when they released WWF King of the Ring. Although this time the games were released so close together that they basically feature the same exact roster, but instead of giving you the steel cage game mode, this time they gave you a King of the Ring game mode, which was essentially just implementing a tournament system back into the game, which at this point for wrestling games was nothing new. What was your favorite Nintendo Entertainment System wrestling game? Let me know down in the comments.